Father in heaven, we come before you on this Sabbath in need, in desperate need. We recognize that we don't have what it's going to take to get us all the way to the kingdom. And every day is a new experience, and every Sabbath is a new experience. Father, we invite you into our presence this Sabbath. May the blood of Yeshua cover us so that your Spirit can have its way on our minds and hearts. We ask that you lead us and guide us as we search your word. Again, we claim the promise that Yeshua gave us, that when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, he will lead us and guide us into all truth and show us things to come. We pray these things in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right. So last week we talked about a little bit about Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. We want to kind of continue on that same vein because we're going to jump back into the book of Daniel, and we're going to go into a little bit of Revelation because you can't go into Daniel without Revelation. And I like to say also, Daniel is the foundation for the book of Revelation, and people, they tell me, oh, they've got the book of Revelation figured out, and then I ask them, well, have you got Daniel figured out? And really, you can't understand the book of Revelation unless you've got the foundation in its proper place in the book of Daniel. So Yeshua points us back in Matthew 24 to the book of Daniel, and in the answer, now this is really important, the answer to his question, to the disciples' question, the question was, what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So we should expect that the answer should have something to do with his coming and the end of the age. This is where we missed this, and all of a sudden we have all these ideas about, he's talking about 70 AD, and there's the preterist view that all Matthew 24 was all fulfilled at the first coming of Yeshua. And this goes totally against his word. And I just don't understand why people can't see that, but that's maybe the problems with me. Maybe I'm the one that's not seeing it. But I do believe that the answer has to relate to the question. I mean, if you guys have been in school, all of you at some point, you ask the teacher a question, and you're hoping that it has something to do with the question. The answer is going to have something to do with the question that you asked. And that's what we should expect, Yeshua giving an answer to the question. And so that's what we're doing. We're asking the questions, and we should expect answers. The part of the answer, and it's the climactic answer to the question, he says, therefore. So he goes through the whole thing, starts with deception, and then he goes through there's going to be persecution, and the love of many will wax cold, and then he says this gospel will go to all the kingdom, and then the end will come. And then he says right after that in verse 15, therefore. So the question is, what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? And then he ends up with a therefore. The therefore has direct connection to the question. It's the significant event that when we see this thing, that is the sign of his coming and the end of the age. But, with interpretations, sometimes people think the abomination of desolation happened over 1,000 years ago. Well, it was a nice effort, but here at the time of the end, it doesn't really work. When we start reading these prophecies for what they say, it's very clear that the abomination of desolation is not set up until the time of the end. And this is what we're looking at. And that's a new thought to a lot of people. But if we will take Yeshua's words and just read them as they say, it really makes a lot of sense. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at this, and then we're going to jump back into Daniel, because that's what Yeshua said. Go back to Daniel. And the question, we can't lose sight of the question. The question is, what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? And then he says, therefore, go back to Daniel. And he says, let the wise, or let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains here again. We looked at these verses before, but they're going to directly connect to where we're going today. So I just wanted to recap there. The obvious thing to me, and this is to me, I speak for myself, the obvious thing to me is that this is in the time of the end. Now, not only that, he gives a specific geographical fix. Standing in the holy place, up on the Mount of Olives. He's looking down at the temple. He says, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, they would have assumed that he's talking about the temple. There would be no question about the location. And just in case we missed that, he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So we've got a temple, and we've got fleeing to the Judean hills and to the mountains. We've got a geographical fix of where this abomination is going to be. And as I said last week, it's not Paris, France. In fact, I would be very surprised if anyone in Judea saw the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in 508 AD. Are you with me? Did we get that? There's no way those people in Judea in 508 AD would have been able to flee to the mountains, because they wouldn't have had a clue what was going on in France. Yeah, there was no temple in Jerusalem at that time either. It had been destroyed. And the Jews were dispersed all over the world. So it just doesn't work. It just plain doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, then we've got to go and try and figure out what does work in our time. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Well, I think everyone here watching today believes that they're living at the time of the end. If we're actually living at the time of the end, and we don't just think we're living at the time of the end, you see, there's a huge difference. The people that have gone before us thought they were living at the time of the end, but according to Yeshua, in a few different places, he says we can know we're at the time of the end. And he says, when you see these things, know that the end is near, even at the doors. See what things? See the world events that are spoken of in the prophets. Goes on to say, let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant in those days and nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight be not in the winter or on the Sabbath. And we've talked about this before. The idea is he's talking about those in Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be the epicenter of where the abomination of desolation will sit. And this is in keeping with other prophecies. Isaiah chapter 14 especially, where Satan says he will sit on the sides of the north in the congregation. And this is what Satan's goal is, to have everyone on this planet worshiping him. That's very obvious. He tried to do that with Yeshua. He thought if he could just get Yeshua to fall down and worship him, and he would give him the kingdom. And all of this, we know these things. And Yeshua said, no way. So he couldn't do it with Yeshua, but he's going to do it. He's going to try and do it with everyone on this planet. Because there's a controversy going on that most people don't understand. The controversy is between Satan and not God the Father so much. It's with Yeshua. And so the problem is with Yeshua because Satan knows that Yeshua is going to receive the kingdom. That's what the prophecy in Daniel 7, where we're going to look at today. The prophecy in Daniel 7 says that Yeshua receives the kingdom. But Satan wants to receive the kingdom. Why does he want to do that? You see, man was the crowning act of creation. And Satan has set up a system that man has been attracted towards Satan. All the bright lights, all the things that attract us away from God. His accusation against God, one of his accusations against God is, you have created a being that if given the choice, they would much rather worship me and follow me than they would follow you. And we don't really think about that, but that's the whole purpose of Satan, is to sway this world away from God. And it even tells us this in Revelation. It says, and the world wandered after the beast, and it was the dragon, Satan, that gave the beast the power that it had, so that everyone will fall into a worship system that's contrary to God's worship system. And we know these things, but this is what's going on here. When Yeshua points us back to Daniel, he says the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Let's reason this a little bit further. Who actually is the abomination of desolation? The one that causes desolation. Is it a man, or is it a spiritual being, as in Satan? I would propose that it's actually Satan himself coming back as a counterfeit second coming, and he is that abomination of desolation spoken of by not only Daniel the prophet. In Revelation chapter 9, he's called Apollyon, the destroyer. This is Satan himself coming. It's not a priest. It's not a pope. The pope plays a role in it, but it's certainly, the pope is not the abomination of desolation, the abomination that causes desolation. The abomination that causes desolation is Satan himself, the one that opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. That's the ultimate Antichrist. And that's the one that is going to come back and sit in a temple as God, claiming to be God. In 2 Thessalonians, we see that. So he tells people at the time of the end, pray that your flight be not in the winter. In other words, we're going to have to go through the winter at the time of the end, at the time of the abomination of desolation. We're going to have to go through the winter. That should tell us something, because winter follows fall. So we're going to have to go through the winter and get to the spring. And I would propose, as I've shown and demonstrated in other videos, that our deliverance from this world, as it was in the Exodus, our deliverance will come in the spring after the 7 last plagues have been poured out, just like what happened in Egypt, which is our pattern. There were 7 last plagues poured out on only the Egyptians, and then they were delivered in the spring. That is a pattern for our deliverance in the time of the end. And that's why Yeshua warns us, pray that your flight be not in the winter. In other words, be where you need to be by winter time, because if you're not, your flight is going to have to be or will be in the winter. Is this making sense? We're just trying to figure out what Yeshua was trying to tell us and make sense of what he was trying to tell us. What is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? the abomination of desolation, pray that your flight be not in the winter. He's telling us the event and the timing of events. That is exactly what they asked him. And that's what he's telling us. Luke 21, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And this is what people say, well, this is talking about 70 AD when Titus came up to take Jerusalem. Well, if we look at all of what Yeshua was referring to, Jerusalem again will be surrounded by armies. What we saw in 70, what we didn't see, what we have read about in 70 AD is only a miniature of what's going to happen on a worldwide scale when the Antichrist will be in control of the whole world, but he will be reigning from Jerusalem, because if there's going to be a counterfeit Christ, where would he reign? They're all expecting him to come to Jerusalem. And so why wouldn't he reign there? This is why Jerusalem is now, even now, becoming the focal point. Everyone's looking to Jerusalem. All different religions, whether you're Christian, Muslim, and Jews, of course, are looking at that. And we need to be wise and know that the reason why Jerusalem is becoming a focal point is because that's not where Yeshua is coming back to reign. That's where the Antichrist is going to reign, and that's why it's becoming a focal point. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. This is emergency right here, and that's the terminology. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things, we don't want to miss that, that all things which are written will or may be fulfilled. What are the all things? Go back to the question again. What is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And he said all these things are going to have to be fulfilled. So it's interesting, when we go back and look at all the things that he spoke about in these chapters, we can see clearly that not all the things have been fulfilled. And so these things have to be fulfilled, and as Yeshua said, that this generation shall not pass away. The generation that sees these things will not pass away till all is fulfilled. That's in Matthew 24. It goes on in Luke 21, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Here again, the Jews are going to suffer again. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles shall be are fulfilled. And this is what we looked at last week as well. And the time of the Gentiles, as we were looking very easily, when we get to the book of Revelation, it actually tells us how long the times of the Gentiles. It doesn't tell us in Luke, but in Revelation, which is a further revelation of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, tells us how long the time of the Gentiles is. Same terminology, same event here. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, rise, measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship there. Now let me ask you a question. What is going on here? What is actually happening when God says measure the temple and those that worship? What is this? Somebody help me here. What's going on? Judgment. That's what it's talking about. This is talking about a judgment period. But leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So this goes exactly with what Luke recorded in his gospel, The Gentiles would tread the holy city underfoot. Here it says basically the same thing, tread the holy city underfoot. But it tells you how long the times or the years of the Gentiles is, and it's for 42 months. And this is a new idea to most people. But, Yeshua said that every scribe instructed in the law brings out old and things new. We should expect to hear new things if we're listening to somebody. Things that we haven't heard before, connections that we haven't seen before. And it's not because somebody's any smarter than anyone else. If the Spirit of God is enlightening us in the time of the end, which we are promised He would, then we should expect to see new understanding or greater understanding of Scripture. And someone might say, well, new light will never contradict old light. Let's think about that for a second. What is the purpose of truth? Number one, the purpose of truth is to help change our minds. Did you get that? Help change our minds. If I go into my bedroom and I change my shirt, why am I doing that? Well, I want to put on a new shirt, but maybe I got that shirt dirty. The idea is if truth is to change our minds, then it's going to displace something. What does truth displace? It displaces error. Things that we may have thought are truth. So just because we've believed something in the past doesn't make it truth. And so if we see something new, a new understanding, and it doesn't fit perfectly with our old understanding, is it possible, I just throw this question out here, is it possible that our old understanding wasn't actually truth, but it was thought to be truth? It wasn't actually an immovable pillar, but we thought it was an immovable pillar? Is that making sense? And so if in the last days we're going to have a flood of light, I propose it's to displace anything that we have previously believed that isn't 100% solid. And that's what people don't understand. I think it's absolutely true, is new light will never contradict old light or old understandings if, and the qualifier, the big qualifier, if the old understanding was 100% true. Truth will never contradict truth. The question is the new truth contradicting error? And yes, it needs to contradict error because we don't want to believe error. So I tell people, look, have a look at this. This makes way more sense than what you're trying to say, because what you're trying to say doesn't actually work with other scriptures that are talking about the same topic, but in a different way. So what we need to do is take what we've known in the past and grow in our understanding. And I would propose that some of the things that we believed to be true in the past will fall away. And that's a very scary idea, because that places the responsibility on us to determine what's truth or not. Isn't it a lot easier just to accept, a canned bill of goods and just start eating it and not worry about whether it's truth or not? We can't do that. Yeshua opened up Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 with "don't be deceived" in the time of the end. Very, very important. We've got to prove everything we believe to be, that we think is truth, and be ready to discard anything that may not fit with the rest of Scripture, the things that we're looking at. So here we see that the time of the Gentiles in Luke chapter 21, the time of the Gentiles is given. It's 3.5 years, or 42 months, 1,260 days. And I would propose that those are actually days and not years. Trampled by the Gentiles, tread underfoot, Luke and the book of Revelation go hand in hand, Luke 21 and the book of Revelation, both talking about the same time periods, about the time of the end. So here we see here that the time of the Gentiles is actually 42 months, and that's the span. So we've looked at this before, but we need to look at this. We need to connect this right here, because when we go back to Daniel, we're going to see this again. Revelation 13 tells us that he, the beast, talking about, was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. So we see the same time period that's built on Luke, the times of the Gentiles, and also in Revelation chapter 11, this 42-month period, we see it again. This is a repeat. We're seeing the same story again, so we should see greater events. So we see the Gentiles in control of Jerusalem in the time of the end for a 42-month period, and we see that there's going to be someone, a being that has a mouth, and he speaks great things and blasphemy. What are these great things? I would propose, without looking in detail, but one of the great things that he's speaking is world peace. This is a great thing. And if we go back in Revelation 13, we can see that. We can see that he brings peace to the world. And then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. So this is a power that brings peace, and he blasphemes God. So it's a spiritual or a religious entity has to be a part of this, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Okay, now here's where we have to change gears in some of our understanding. We think, or some of us have been taught, and for those that haven't been taught, that's great, because it's going to be a lot easier to understand. But it says here, the beast. What is the beast? We're going to look at what the beast is. The beast was given. Well, what does the beast look like? The beast was given something that it didn't have. And we're going to look at that here. This beast has 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns, body of a leopard, feet of a bear, and it has the mouth of a lion. And then after we see the beast, it says it's given a mouth, speaking great things. So is this the lion beast? We're going to go back to Daniel, and we're going to look at this. This is Daniel chapter 7, with all the beasts of Daniel chapter 7 come together. We're told in Daniel chapter 7, which we're going to look at, that these are in Daniel chapter 7, they're kingdoms. So if we see in Revelation the same animals, I think it is safe to assume that these are kingdoms again, because Revelation is built on the book of Daniel. So now we see all these same animals coming together as one. This is nothing less than the New World Order. And then this New World Order, it says, is given a mouth, an additional mouthpiece that speaks great things. The reason why I say that is the mouth is a power, a religious power, that is given to this beast. This beast is already in play, and then this entity comes in and takes control of the beast. The beast is not the mouth, nor is the mouth the beast. The beast is made up of 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns, body of a leopard, feet of a bear, and mouth of a lion. These are the kingdoms of the world that have come together, and there's a separate entity that comes in and basically swoops in and takes control. The mouth speaking great things is the harlot of Revelation 17, and she continues for 42 months. We're going to see this very clear in Daniel chapter 7. It's the same time period as this little horn power. So the mouth speaking great things is the harlot of Revelation 17, and it's also the mouth that speaks great things, the little horn, from the book of Daniel. I want to stress the little horn and the harlot and the mouth that speaks great things is not the beast. The harlot, the little horn, rides the beast. That's what it says. And that's really the problem that we have when we've been taught something for so long. We believe it's true and there's no other alternative. A lot of people choose not to even look at something else because they think they're going to get deceived. But if we will just go back and read it, it says that the harlot rides the beast. Now, if the harlot is the papacy, which I think it is, if the harlot is the papacy, and I don't think there's any question in a lot of people's minds. I know there is question, but a lot of people believe that the harlot is the papacy. How is it possible that the harlot rides the papacy? That just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And we know that in Revelation 17, it says the harlot is riding this scarlet-colored beast. And then the question is, well, what beast is that? And some will say, well, that's the Revelation 17 beast, which we're not going to look at today, but the Revelation 17 beast is a seven-headed dragon that has 10 horns and 7 crowns. Can't miss that point. It's got 7 crowns, which would mean there's 7 kingdoms ruling that power. But it has, in Revelation 17, we're told that there's a harlot that rides that beast as well, and that makes perfect sense. But then when we get to Revelation chapter 13, we see this mouth speaking great things and blasphemies that continues for 42 months is equal to the little horn. Same time periods, same events, making war against the saints and so on. So we know for certainty the Revelation 13 beast is the kingdoms of the world that have come together. So when we get to Revelation 13, follow me closely now. When we get to Revelation 13, as we've just seen, is there are 7 heads on this beast of Revelation 13. That's the beast of Revelation 12. But it has come together with the lion, the bear, and the leopard. So the 7-headed dragon in Revelation 12 is representative of earthly powers. Which earthly powers? If we go back to Daniel 7, we'll see that. There was originally 10 horns, but 3 were uprooted, and we were left with 7. So this is the amalgamation of the 4th beast of Daniel 7 and the lion, the bear, and the leopard. And we see it all come together. These kingdoms all come together in Revelation 13, and we have a harlot riding it. So the point being, and the reason why I've gone through this so carefully, is that the beast are kingdoms of the world that have come together for the last-ditch effort, if you will, to destroy all of God's people, with the harlot riding it, pushing it in the direction that it wants to go. And of course, the harlot wants to rule the world, and Satan is the mastermind behind all of this. And so the question now, as we're going to go through this, what happens to the harlot? Because Satan, when he finishes with someone or something, some entity, he will destroy it because he has no more purpose. The papacy is just a tool in the hand of the enemy of God to bring us to a point in history, in the future, to a point where Satan himself can step in and pick up the pieces. That's what we want to look at today. So here we go back to Luke again. Jerusalem trampled by the Gentiles, the holy city tread underfoot times. And this is the times of the Gentiles at this time period. The mouth speaking great things war against the saints. Now, I've never heard anyone share anything about the times of the Gentiles being actually the times and a half. And this is the time period where they're going to rule in Jerusalem. This also, if we take it for just what it says, this does not work with the historical application of these prophecies. And we're going to look at some of these things that just don't line up because the papacy did not rule in Jerusalem for any great long periods of time, i.e. 1,260 years, the times of the Gentiles. This has always been confusing. I believe that this little connection is a product of us living at the time of the end, and God has said, hey, you need to have a look at this. This really doesn't work, and we need to, this is the attitude we need to have, is if something doesn't work, we need to look for something that does. We touched on this a little bit. Revelation chapter 12 has the 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns. But when we get into, I know there was a question that came in this week, what do we do with Revelation 12? Well, Revelation 12 fits perfectly right in. Revelation 12 is the forerunner to Revelation 13, and it shows where the persecution begins. This is what we're not really seeing. The persecution actually starts with the dragon with 7 heads. And then when the New World Order is formed and the dragon with 7 heads becomes part of the lion, the bear, and the leopard, these other kingdoms come into its fold, then the persecution really takes off all over the world. But the persecuting power first happens in an area of the world where the little horn will have control, because the little horn's behind all the persecution, because he's the direct agent of Satan to destroy God's people, and that's where it will start. Well, if I asked anyone where they thought the little horn would be, if you think it's the papacy, obviously that's Europe. That's a kingdom that's made up of several kings, and I believe that's what Revelation is actually talking about. It's talking about the European Union, not the European Union back over 1,000 years ago, but the European Union as we're seeing it develop today. And this is where the persecuting power will be first and foremost, and then will go to the ends of the earth. A lot of people think that the United States is going to be first and foremost to start persecuting God's people. But the United States is a come along later entity, and they have to adopt the New World System as we see down the road when that second beast comes up. The persecution is already happening before the second beast of Revelation 13. We're not going to look at that today, but that's the way it reads. And so the United States is going to adopt the system that is already in place in Europe. And we can see these things developing. We can see them being put into place right now. That's how we know. Yeshua said, when you see these things begin to happen, lift up your heads because your redemption draws nigh. And we're certainly seeing these things begin to happen. So if we go to Revelation 12, it says, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And this time period, this 1,260-day time period, 42 months, and times and half, is portrayed 7 times between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. It's the time period that is recorded in Scripture more than any other time period. That tells me it is the most important time period to figure out. and I am proposing that these are days in the time of the end. It hasn't had an application. These prophecies have had an application in the past, but they're primarily at the time of judgment when the little horn is doing its activities, and we're going to go through step by step on how that judgment happens actually during the time that the little horn is speaking. And we've had that sort of the cart before the horse on some of that, which we're going to look at and demonstrate that the judgment actually has to happen during the time that the little horn and the harlot are doing its dirty work of trying to destroy God's people. Of course, they're not going to be successful, totally successful, but they are going to do quite a work. So the woman's given 2 wings where she flies into the wilderness for a time, times and a half a time. This is the same time period. I also want to note here, and this is something that is missed a lot of times. And you've likely heard me say this again, but there's people watching these videos. We're getting all kinds of comments coming in that people have never seen some of this stuff. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to repeat a few things because people are watching this for the first time. It's very interesting that we have a 1,260-day time period, we have a 42-month time period, and we have a times and a half time period. All of these are not on a Gregorian calendar. You can't have 3.5 years in today's calendar and have 1,260 days or 42 months. It doesn't work. Well, how does it work then? It only works on a biblical calendar. When I say biblical calendar, I mean God's original calendar that he laid out from the creation. And if we go back to the account of Noah, we can see that the flood came in the 2nd month on the 17th day, and it ended on the 7th month on the same day. So, and then it says it's 150 days or 5 months, which would be exactly a 30-day month period for every year, which would mean there'd be 1,260 days in a 3.5 year period in the time of the end. Why is this important? Because God's going to finish his calendar. This is what we haven't understood in in times past. In our historical application of some of these prophecies, we have not understood two major facts. Is that God has given the prophecies in these time periods so that we can know that God's going to finish his work on the same calendar that he started with. This is how the wise are going to understand, because they understand what God is doing. You see, with this calendar, with this restoration of the calendar, comes the festivals. And this is what no other generation that has gone before us has seen as clearly as we're seeing now. So when we're looking at this idea, God's going to set the original calendar in play, and he's also going to restore the festivals, which are a prophetic calendar of events on how God's plan of salvation is going to come to fruition, how it's going to be played out. That would be the Passover. What does the Passover mean? What is it a type of? The Feast of First Fruits, Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles. How do all of these things play out when it comes to the plan of salvation? Well, when we look at that, and this is what no other generation has really seen, when we look at those in detail in this time of restoration of these things, because it's only when we start to practice them does God start to show us what they actually mean. Then we go back into the prophecies and we can actually pick out, and this is what we're going to do here today. We're going to draw out the festival calendar, and this is what the historical application has not done. They've tried, they've made an attempt, they saw some of the importance of some of the prophetic calendar, the festival calendar, but they have not opened it up in its fullness. And I would propose when we do that, we're going to be able to clearly discern what is truth and error when it comes to these prophecies. And that's what we're seeing today. If we do not use the festival calendar in our understanding of the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, we will never, and I say this again, we will never get the timing of the events portrayed in the prophecies correct. The harlot will be the one that's riding not only the beast of Revelation chapter 12, but when the beast of Revelation chapter 12, the seven-headed beast with the 10 horns, 7 crowns, comes together with the beast of Revelation, which has 7 heads, 10 horns, but it has not 7 crowns, but 10 crowns. Where the extra crowns come, they're the extra kingdoms that are in control of this beast, which are the lion, the bear, and the leopard. Those are where the 3 extra crowns, the 3 extra kingdoms, all these kingdoms coming together with the harlot riding that entity, that beast power, and then the harlot is in control for 3.5 years. Okay, so let's keep going here. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Yeshua. And we see in Revelation 19, verse 10, the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy. And it's very interesting. In the book of Revelation, the testimony of Yeshua is referred to, I think, 7 or 8 times as something that God's people have or in possession of, and that's the spirit of prophecy. So they have an understanding of prophecy. And as we've said before, the spirit of prophecy is not a person as much as it is the person of Yeshua, who is really the spirit of prophecy that inspired the prophets. And we see this in 1 Peter, I believe it's verse 10, where it says, where Peter says it was the spirit of Yeshua that was inspiring the prophets. And this is what we're going to have. We're going to have the spirit of Yeshua, which is the spirit of prophecy, inspiring us here at the time of the end, because God is going to give us the gift that we need to get through, and that gift is the Spirit of Yeshua dwelling in us and leading us and guiding us into all truth and showing us things to come. Absolutely vital for us here in the time of the end. And as we go back into the Word, we can see that God gave His people prophecy so they knew what was coming. Not only what was coming in prophecies, like when Israel had Jeremiah tell them that they would go back and go back to Jerusalem after the captivity. There were those kinds of prophecies, but there were also the kinds of prophecies that we see in the book of Kings, where the king of Israel was warned in advance that the enemy would be in such a place, and he would avoid that. These are the kind of things that we're going to need in the time of the end. And it's the spirit of prophecy that reveals the future, not only what's in the Bible itself, but the spirit of prophecy will give us warnings as to events that are going to happen that aren't necessarily recorded in Scripture. That's kind of scary, isn't it? That's going to mean that you're going to have to know the voice of Yeshua. And that's what he said. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me and not another. This is the importance of knowing 100% for sure that it's the Spirit of Yeshua leading us, and not the spirit of the Antichrist, because we're told in John, 1 John chapter 3 or 4, tells us that many false spirits or counterfeit spirits have gone into the world, and then he equates that as to false prophets. And the reason is because when we look in the Old Testament and Kings, we can see that the evil spirits work through the false prophets to mislead and misguide God's people. And we don't want to fall prey to that. So let's take the information that we're seeing now and go back and do what Yeshua said and go back to Daniel. Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 13 are talking about exactly the same events. In Daniel chapter 7, we see the 4 beasts. Daniel has a dream. He sees 4 beasts coming up from the sea, all different from one another. He gives a little bit of insight into each of those beasts, but then he focuses on the little horn. We're going to see that here. Those great beasts which are 4 kings that arise out of the earth. Here again, I have to ask the question. This says they are 4 kings that arise out of the earth. Are they symbolic kingdoms? Are they actual literal kingdoms? I think if we read the chapter, it's definitely talking about literal kingdoms, and I think that's going to become clear. But we really need to understand here that they are literal kingdoms. Because when we get to Revelation chapter 13, which is the sister to Revelation or Daniel chapter 7, they are still literal kingdoms. That's my point. So if we see that all the kingdoms are separate and working independently in Daniel chapter 7, this is the forecast, if you will, as to what's going to happen. And we see this in Daniel chapter 7. It says that the little horn power consumes the whole earth. So if it consumes the whole earth, I believe that's in, oh boy, that's later on, verse 24, I believe, in chapter 7 of Daniel. It consumes the whole earth. Then wouldn't it consume these kingdoms as well? Wouldn't it rule over these kingdoms as well? That's exactly what that would mean. If these are kingdoms of the earth, the major kingdoms of the earth, and the little horn power actually consumes them, then it would be ruling over them, which would parallel to Revelation 13 when they all come together with the harlot ruling over it. So my point is that Revelation 13 is a view of the New World Order when the animals or the kingdoms have all come together in one, and then this mouth that's added to this beast is none other than the little horn power or the harlot of Revelation 17. And it then rides this beast when it's all come together. But Daniel chapter 7, we see the preview when they're still working independent. And I would propose this is what we have today, is that these kingdoms are independent of each other, but the day is coming when they're all going to come together and work together, and the little horn power will be ruling over all of them. And someone might say, well, who are these kingdoms? We've got other videos. I don't want to get into that, but we need to understand that, of course, that these kingdoms come together. Then the interesting part here is Daniel's focal point. If you take it all, he spends as much time on the little horn as he does all the other beasts combined. This tells me that the little horn becomes the focal point of Daniel, and the question is, why is that? Well, we're told, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. Daniel 7 beast, the 4th beast, is equal to, not similar to, but equal to Revelation chapter 12. the seven-headed dragon that has also 10 horns and 7 crowns. We're going to see why it ends up down the road with 7 crowns. We see that here. It says, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming from whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up out by the roots, and there in this horn were the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking pompous words. So on its head were 10 horns, and then another horn came up, and 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. So my question is, how many horns are left? Well, you might say there's 8. Well, yeah, there is 8, but there's a separate horn that's different from the other horns, and there's 7 remaining from it. So the 7 horns that are remaining, I believe, are represented in the 7 crowns of the Revelation chapter 12 beast. Those are the remaining kingdoms, and that's why it's termed its crowns. Those are the remaining kingdoms that rule on that dragon beast in Revelation chapter 12. So this dreadful beast, this dragon-type beast, is represented again in Revelation chapter 12 with a little more information. It's a persecuting power, and we see that in Revelation 13. The mouth, here it says, the mouth speaking pompous words or great things, is the same power in Revelation 13 now when we get to the beast is given a mouth speaking pompous words. Exactly the same entity. The beast of Revelation 13 is an amalgamation of the world kingdoms, as we saw in Daniel chapter 7, all coming together as a new world order, and the harlot rides that beast. The beast is not the harlot. The beast is not the papacy. The harlot rides the kingdoms of the earth. And that becomes very clear when we look at it through these lenses. All the other scriptures that have to do with it make much more sense, as we're going to be seeing that as we go. Little horn's activity. Daniel again here. Now he's focusing on the little horn. Why is this? I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. We saw this, the mouth that the beast of Revelation 13 was given, this entity that the beast was given that was already made, the harlot, this mouth speaking great things, was making war against the saints. This is how we know it's the same entity. The mouth speaking great things in Revelation 13 is not the beast, it's the little horn from Daniel chapter 7 that does exactly the same thing, and we can see that it's the same time period, as we're going to see here again, that in Revelation 13 the mouth has 3.5 years or 42 months, same time period. But I want to look at something that I find quite interesting here. It says, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. That's persecution. But look what it says. Until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. I want to look at something here because this is extremely important. It says here that there's a time period here, and we've seen this time period. It's a 42-month time period that this little horn, and we're going to see this, we pulled that from Revelation, and we're going to see this here again in Daniel chapter 7. Same time period, little horn, it's making war against the saints. Don't miss this point. It makes war against the saints. So whenever it starts, there's a starting point, obviously, and it makes war against the saints for 42 months until, so it's making war until something, until a time period. And what is that time period? Until judgment. Watch this. until judgment. So this is how it makes war against the saints until judgment. Is that what it says? Is that what it says? It says it makes war against the saints and prevailing against them until judgment. If the little horn has power for 42 months, and I just stay with me here for a second. If I start that at 538 AD, if I start that at 538 AD, and I end that at 1798, and I make judgment at 1844, it doesn't work. Do you see that? It says it makes war against the saints until judgment. In the historical application of prophecy, we say that the little horn only reigns until 1798. According to the Word of God, it says that it reigns and persecutes until judgment. You follow this? It doesn't work. We cannot have judgment, according to what it says in the book, we cannot have judgment outside of this time period. In other words, judgment would have had to happen during the time of the little horn. Now, is that reasonable? Of course it's reasonable. Because during the time of great persecution, God says, enough is enough. And he begins the judgment. You see, the historical application is pretty good, but it just doesn't fit with all the specifications as they're laid out in the prophecies. So when every specification in a prophecy is not met, that means we have to go back and have another look. And so that's what we're doing. So what I'm suggesting is the historical application doesn't actually work, so we've got to look at something else that does work. Well, what does work, what we know for sure, according to the Word, is the little horn reigns for 42 months, but judgment happens sometime during the reign of the little horn. And we're going to see this really clear when we get to Daniel chapter 8. Because when we have a second look at Daniel chapter 8, it actually says exactly the same thing. I watched till thrones were put in place. The Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair on his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. So what we've done here is we've gone back to the vision in Daniel chapter 7, where we're introduced to the little horn, and it says in verse 8, it says the little horn speaks pompous words. We don't really know what that's all about, but we can see here as we relate those pompous words to the interpretation that the angel gives Daniel. Gives him the interpretation, tells him that this little horn is a kingdom power persecuting God's people, tells him how long there's going to be a judgment, and then his kingdom is taken away. So then we go back to where the judgment is seen, and it's in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, goes from speaking great things, and then it breaks into this narrative about the judgment. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, his hair as his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. We go on in verse 10. It says, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were open. So this goes along with what I was suggesting here as we go from verse 8, when the little horn is speaking pompous words, it breaks into a judgment, a court scene judgment, and this has been coined a judgment that happens prior to the second coming, which is exactly what's going on here. This is a judgment that happens prior to the second coming, and this court happens not too long, but if we think about this for a second, as we were talking about earlier, when would this judgment begin? Well, if we understand the festival calendar correctly, we would know when the judgment begins. When does the judgment begin? A lot of people think it begins on the Day of Atonement, but it actually begins 10 days earlier on the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets announces the opening of the judgment. The judgment closes 10 days later on the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is not the opening of judgment, it is the close of judgment. We can't miss that point. The other point that I want to make here is that when we look at the first coming types, as in when Yeshua was here, we saw that he died at the Passover, on the very day of the Passover. He rose on the very day of first fruits. He poured out his Spirit on the very day, the 24-hour period of Pentecost. How is it, just expand your mind for a second, how is it that we get to the fall feast and somehow some are thinking that we've been in the Day of Atonement for nearly 200 years? Does God change the way he does things? How about that these are day for a day, year for a year, month for a month, and the Day of Atonement, as in the prophecies, when the little horn is persecuting in the time of the end, because we all know that the little horn is going to be doing this persecution, and it's day for a day, year for a year, when the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Trumpets roll around in the time of the end, it's just like the first coming. It's a day for a day, a year for a year, a month for a month. And it's actually going to be the fall feast being fulfilled the way they're supposed to be fulfilled. The days of awe, the 10 days of awe, which are the 10 days of judgment prior to Yeshua's second coming, all happening during the time that the little horn is speaking, because God says enough is enough. And that's what we're looking at here. This parallels actually Revelation chapter 14, verse 6, when John sees these angels flying in the midst of heaven, and they're giving the everlasting gospel to preach to every kindred, tongue, nation, and people. And they're saying, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of your judgment has come. This is a precision. This is like a laser-guided missile. The hour of God's judgment. It all comes down to the hour, not the century of God's judgment, but the hour of God's judgment, this precise time when judgment begins. And I would propose, as we look at the whole festival calendar, that the judgment actually begins at trumpets and closes on the Day of Atonement. So we see in Revelation 14, verse 6, this is the last call, if you will, through the 10 days of judgment to get it right with God before it's forever too late, and the Day of Atonement comes and goes, and the 7 last plagues are poured out, as we see in Revelation 15 and 16. Revelation 15 and 16 tells us that he saw the tabernacle of the testimony opened in heaven, and no man was able to enter it until the 7 last plagues were completed. Well, the only time that the tabernacle of the testimony is opened in the earthly sanctuary is on the Day of Atonement. So if we see in the book of Revelation when the tabernacle of the testimony, that's the Holy of Holies, where the throne of God is, where the foundation of God's government, which is the 10 Commandments, and if you will, the Torah that goes with it, if that's the foundation of God's government, and this place in heaven is opened, that can be none other than the Day of Atonement. So we can see as we're looking at these prophecies that the festival calendar is completely in play in the time of the end. That's how we can know when the 7 last plagues are poured out. It's at the close of the Day of Atonement when every decision forever has been made up of whether we're going to accept God's plan and take it for our own, or we're going to do what Satan wants us to do and be lost forever. And of course, we know what we have to do. But we can see here that these prophecies connect all the way through. Revelation 14 is not a separate chapter. It goes along with Revelation 13 when the little horn power, the harlot, is warring against the saints, forcing upon people the mark of the beast. So in Daniel chapter 7, when it says it changes times and laws, that has to do with the mark of the beast. It incorporates its own times and laws. This is what we have not understood in the prophecies, in the interpretations of the past. It changes God's times and laws, his calendar, and incorporates that in the state calendar, the state-approved religion, and that is what constitutes the mark of the beast. It's Satan's mark that he has the harlot and the rest of the world enforcing, and God's people are standing solid on his laws and on his calendars, on his calendar. This is what we're looking at. These are the understandings that I believe God is giving in these last days so that we can get the whole picture of what is going on. In verse 11 of Daniel chapter 7, I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. I want to open this up just a little bit here. Very interesting here. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, we see the little horn speaking pompous words. It breaks into a judgment scene, and then we go back to the little horn speaking. Why does it do that? Because the little horn is speaking. Let's get rid of that. Let's call this line judgment. The little horn is speaking, but judgment happens during the time it's speaking, and then now we're on the other side of judgment. There's been a judgment. Now we're on the other side in Daniel chapter 7, verse 11. I watched them because of the sound of the little horn speaking pompous words. So all the way through its 42 months or times and a half, at some point during that time, judgment happens. And now there has to be an execution of judgment. And that execution of judgment on the little horn, its body is destroyed and given to the burning flame. Question, when does this happen? It's not until Revelation 17, 16, and 18 that we get the details on this. And we want to look at that. If you have your Bibles with you, which I'm sure you do, I want you to turn to Revelation 17, and we see what's going on here, starting at verse 16. I'll give you a moment to get there. Talking about the time that the harlot is riding the kingdoms of the earth. We've seen here that the 10 horns, 10 crowns represent 10 kingdoms that are ruling at the time that the little horn is speaking. The harlot's riding these 10 kings. But something happens, and it says, And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these are the 10 kingdoms that make up the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate, naked, eat her flesh, burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, because there's been a judgment, as we saw in Daniel chapter 7, in favor of the saints. And the judgment, if it's in favor of the saints, it's against the harlot or the little horn. And so what God does is he puts it in the hearts of the kingdoms that the little horn is ruling to destroy the harlot. And I believe the very simplest answer could be is that the 10 kingdoms that the harlot is ruling over finally get wise enough to understand that the harlot's only in it for herself and is just using these kings. And God puts it in their hearts to do what? For God put it in their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman which you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And that great city is Babylon. And of course, Babylon, this great city, is none other than the papacy that's ruling in Jerusalem. The papacy has a long time wanted to rule from Jerusalem. We can expect that to happen. That's what the prophecies say. So the 10 kings are the one that destroy the harlot. Now, when we understand that, when we go back to Daniel, that actually makes a lot more sense, because we see something very interesting after the burning of the harlot. Goes on to say, as for the rest of the beasts, that's the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the dreadful beast, made up of these 10 kingdoms of Revelation 13, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Here's another point where the historical application just doesn't work. Why do I keep bringing that up? People say, well, you shouldn't talk about the old prophecies, how the historical application doesn't work. Unless we understand that it doesn't work, we don't tend to look for something that does. And so we need to see the shortfalls in this if we're going to adopt something that makes more sense. So at the time of the destruction of the little horn, that's the end of this time period. At the destruction of the little horn, that's when the 10 kingdoms burn her with fire. The rest of the beasts are still alive, according to what the prophecy says. This doesn't work in our historical application, as we have successive kingdoms all the way through, starting at Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those kingdoms are long gone since that time. But according to the prophecy, as we read it, it says the rest of the beasts not only are alive, the rest of the beasts destroy the harlot, but they're not destroyed at the time of the destruction of the harlot. Why? Because the destruction of the harlot is not the end. There's still time after the destruction of the harlot. And these beasts are still alive at the time of the destruction, because they're the ones doing the destruction. When we take these prophecies and actually critically analyze them, we can see more to the story. Daniel 7:25, he, the little horn, shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, shall intend to change times and laws. Historical application has not equated this to appointed times. At best, the Sabbath, but we're talking, and this isn't the word moed, as we know, because this is not Hebrew. This was not originally written in Hebrew. So the word times is not moed. It's a different word. It's a Chaldean word. And so when we look at the Chaldean word and look at the meaning of the Chaldean word, we can see here that it equates to the word moed. And it's actually telling us, and I find it very interesting, that we have to do some homework. Again, we have to do some homework and find out what this word times is. It's the equivalent to the word moed. And in this context, it's talking about the times and the law, so the appointed times in the law and law itself. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times and a half a time. And God help us through this time, because it says we're given into his hand. This is the same expression as we saw in the book of Job when Job was given into the hand of Satan. And we can see what happened to Job. So we don't want to think that we're going to become, or we're going to be unscathed through this time when the enemy is reigning for this time, times and a half. It's just not going to be so. We need to be spiritually, mentally, and physically prepared for this time, because it's going to be like no other. So that's this time, times and a half, 42-month period, 1,260-day period that we see 7 times between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. So that's the time period which I think is becoming very clear, at least in my mind, that this is a day for a day time period in the time of the end. The little horn's activity during the time, times and a half, but the court shall be seated, they shall take away the little horn's dominion to consume and destroy it. For how long? Forever. So here again, the time, times and a half, it says it's destroyed forever. Forever means forever in my mind. In this context, I believe it means forever. That would mean that there's no resurrection from that, okay? So if we have, again, if we put 538 on that, and we put 1798, it says forever. It's destroyed forever. That would mean that there's no coming back to life. Are you with me? So there again, the historical application doesn't work, because according to the word, it says that the little horn has 42 months, then it's destroyed forever. And forever is just what it says. It's forever. There's no resurrection. There's no coming back to life at the end of time. So it doesn't work. So what does that mean? That would mean that just doesn't work according to what it says. So we have to look at something different again. And the court should be seated. They will consume and destroy it forever. The court seated has to be none other than trumpets and the Day of Atonement. The judgment, once we understand the typology of the feast, what they represent, again, the Passover lamb is Yeshua. We had a question come in. Does that mean that we only have the fall feasts, or the Passover was all fulfilled? No, it doesn't. There's aspects of the feast that are fulfilled. They're cyclical. They come around again and again and again, more than just once. And so different aspects of them are fulfilled. And it's quite easy to see that. We see a judgment time in the book of Daniel, a pre-Advent, pre-Second Advent judgment that happens prior to the second coming. That's what the pre-Advent would mean. Prior to the second coming, we see a judgment. It happens on the time appointed in the calendar. But we also see a judgment at the end of the millennium, and we can expect that's going to be at the same time period, and we can see that very clearly in other studies. We have that. So we can see they're cyclical. So the Passover is no different than the fall feast. They're cyclical as well. We're going to see another fulfillment of the Passover at the second coming. I believe that's when our deliverance happens. That's when the resurrection happens on Feast of First Fruits. That's when the resurrection of Yeshua happened. That's when the resurrection of the saints that slept in their graves happened. That typology of the first fruits is the resurrection, and therefore we can expect a cyclical event in the spring feast as well. According to Yeshua's own words, he says that the Passover in Luke chapter 22, verses 15 through 17, he says that the Passover is not going to be fulfilled until the kingdom of God comes. And that would tell me, well, it's not fulfilled yet. Aspects of it, yes, but not completely fulfilled. They come and they go. They come around in a cyclical manner. And so we can look at all of the festivals as being fulfilled prior to Yeshua coming, certain aspects of them. Now we want to look at, we have a little bit of time left. We want to jump into Daniel 8 because there's things in Daniel 8 that are going to connect beautifully with what we've been looking at. Daniel chapter 8, we see the little horn's activities again. We see in Daniel chapter 8 a ram and a he-goat battle, and we've got videos on that. An end time application of ram and a he-goat battle, which I believe is much better understanding than what we have been taught in the past. And therefore, I think that people should at least check it out. But here again, Daniel focuses in on the little horn's activity, just as he did in Daniel 7. So what I'm suggesting is we're being consistent when we look at it like this. Not only Daniel focused in on the little horn's activity, there was one main reason, and that's because the little horn was instrumental in causing the whole world to persecute God's people. It was the one that initiated the persecution and was first and foremost in doing it. We see exactly the same thing when we get to Daniel 8. We see the little horn doing exactly the same thing. Well, in Daniel chapter 7, along with the little horn's activity came a time period so that we can know how long the little horn is going to do this. And we saw that during that time, the judgment would begin. We're going to see exactly the same thing in Daniel chapter 8, only in Daniel chapter 8, we're going to see the time period when the judgment actually happens. And so it's building on Daniel chapter 7 and looking at Daniel chapter 8 to get more of the story. And that's what we should expect, a little more of the story. Out of one of them, speaking of the little horn now, out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So here we see the little horn in the time of the end is going to go where? It's going to be on an evangelistic crusade, if you will. But I'd like to ask the question, where is it going to end up? Now here at Camp Tamid, we believe we're living in the glorious land. But I don't think I can interpret that as the glorious land. Why not? Because the glorious land is actually the piece of real estate that God has his eye on for a number of different reasons which we won't get into, but the glorious land is the land of Israel. That's where the glorious land is. So we can see by this verse that the little horn is going to have his eye on the glorious land. That's Jerusalem. So that's a little more evidence of what I said earlier, is that the little horn's going to end up in Jerusalem because the little horn believes that it's God's representative on earth, and where else should it reign but the city of the great king? It just kind of makes sense. And ultimately, that's where Satan is going to reign from as well. Goes on to tell us, and it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. These are little horn's activities. Daniel is focused in on the little horn's activity. He, the little horn, even exalts himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the little horn, the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his Yeshua's sanctuary was cast down. This is starting to sound a little bit like Luke 21 and Revelation 11, when leave out the court, it is outside the temple, and leave that because it's been given to the Gentiles. So the Gentiles now have come to Jerusalem. This is what it's talking about here. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the little horn to oppose the daily. And I've put in here, this is building on Daniel chapter 7, oppose the daily, the continual offerings to God, which happen over all of the festival calendar, but begin at the daily, the tamid, the morning and the evening. And I've said before that if you don't have a daily experience with God, which is incorporated in his daily prayer, in his daily prayer time, which is part of the appointed time calendar, if we don't have a daily time with God, it doesn't matter how many festivals we keep, because we really don't have a daily experience with our Messiah, Yeshua. So it begins with the daily, and I find it interesting that it's noted here as the little horn takes away the daily, which equates to Daniel chapter 6, which I believe to be prophetic. Daniel was not allowed to pray, and they knew that he prayed at certain times of the day, which are connected to the daily. So we can expect, in the time of the end, that the little horn is going to change all of God's times, and I would expect that it's going to be law that you're not allowed to worship on any day of the week, but a certain day of the week. Any annual festivals will have to be things like possibly Christmas, Easter, and so on. And so this is where we're going, but you won't even be allowed to pray to any other god, just like Daniel's experience, and he was found praying at the time of the morning and the evening offering. This was his practice, tells us, and we see this all the way through the book of Daniel. Because transgression, an army was given over to the little horn to oppose the daily, change times and laws, and he, the little horn, cast truth to the ground. He, the little horn, did all this and prospers. So it's an entity that doesn't have a real army, and the world army is given to the little horn to enforce the little horn's dictates in the last moment of time in Earth's history. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed, the day of atonement. So when we look at this, when is the sanctuary cleansed? That's the end of judgment. That's the day of atonement. If we go back to Leviticus 16, we can see that that was when all the sins that have been confessed in the house of Israel were put onto the scapegoat and forever gone, and the scapegoat was banished into the wilderness. This is all prophetic that we need to deal with. We're going to deal with it all right now, but in this case right here, the answer to the how long until judgment closes is given in connection to the time period of the little horn. It gives all about the little horn's activity, and then the question or the answer comes how long this is going to happen for. In keeping with the interpretation of Daniel chapter 7, in following the pattern of Daniel chapter 7, it says that the little horn has power over God's people for 3.5 years, then it's destroyed forever. But sometime in Daniel chapter 7, the judgment begins. And then the executive phase, where the kingdoms of the world destroy the harlot because of the judgment, it says he reigns until the Ancient of Days comes and judgment's made in favor of the saints. Then we see the kingdoms destroy the harlot, as we see in a greater picture in Revelation chapter 17. The 10 kingdoms that make up the beast destroy the harlot. Well, in Daniel chapter 8, it talks about this time period of the little horn again, but it says that the sanctuary is cleansed on the Day of Atonement. Wow. So, how do we deal with the 2300 days? It actually says evenings and mornings, and we're talking about the daily when we're in sanctuary time. When we're in the Tamid time, as in referenced in Numbers chapter 28, talks about all the different time periods, it starts with the daily. The daily happened twice. There was a morning sacrifice. There was an evening sacrifice. While Daniel was in Babylon, he kept the appointed time without a sacrifice. So it's very interesting here that the translators understood when it's in sanctuary type terminology, the daily is in reference to the morning and evening, and that's what it says. And that's why the translators put in the word sacrifice. But the word sacrifice is actually not to be in there. Because when we think of a tabernacle and we think of sacrifices, we're thinking of spilling blood. But you can have a daily without spilling the blood, as Daniel had a daily experience with God, a morning and evening in Babylon, without spilling blood. So people in the time of the end, when the sanctuary service is renewed, when it's renewed to God's people, are we sacrificing animals anymore? No, we're not. Because Yeshua is our sacrifice. So it's interesting to note that Daniel did not put the word sacrifice in there because he had a daily experience. His daily time, his daily morning experience was without an animal sacrifice, just as it is with us. I have a daily morning and evening sacrifice time, but we're not out there at the camp sacrificing animals. We don't sacrifice lambs at Passover. We don't eat lambs at Passover. We don't do all these sacrificial systems because Yeshua fulfilled the sacrificial animal part of the sanctuary service. Therefore, we do not. But we still keep the appointed time of the sanctuary because that's God's dates with those he loves, and these are things that he's given us to enhance our relationship with him, and we don't need to spill the blood anymore because Yeshua is our sacrifice. So he says, in relation to the time period and the little horn's activity, you see the little horn's activity is given with a time period. To be consistent with Daniel 7, the little horn time period is in connection with the 2300s, evenings and mornings. And people say, well, you know, that's a 2300 year period. Well, that's not what it says. It's 2300 evenings and mornings. And if you take 2300 and divide it by 2, you're going to get 1150 days out of that. And people say, well, you can't do that. Why can't I do that? Well, because that's not what I believe. Well, just because we believe something doesn't mean we can't do it. Because we might learn that maybe it's a better way of doing things, and that's actually what it says. And I say again that the time period of Daniel 7, the time, times, and a half, is in direct relation to the little horn power. In Daniel chapter 8, we see exactly the same thing, and we have more detail. We have more detail on not only the time, times, and a half, because that's how long the little horn has, but we have a detail on when the judgment begins during the time of the little horn. Why is that important? Because we're going to know when the little horn reigns from Jerusalem. We're going to know when that starts, and we're going to know when judgment begins. It's going to happen 1150 days after this point. And we're going to know when the little horn is destroyed. That's why when we get to Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6, fear God, for the hour of his judgment has come during the time that the beast and the harlot are in full gear. The hour of his judgment has come. And it says, don't accept the mark of the beast of the little horn. And that's when we pull all these things together. I just want to finish up here. So little horn's activity during the time appointed. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. I would propose this is none other than Yeshua himself showing up in Daniel. And now he said, I heard a man's voice from between the banks of the Ulai who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Don't miss these next points. So Yeshua says, Gabriel, make him understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Okay, this is very interesting here. If we go back to Matthew 24, the question was asked, what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Yeshua opens with none of it. He just says, don't be deceived. So the question is, what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? And he says, don't be deceived. He starts with the answer to the question that they weren't looking for, but it's the most important thing. So this is the way he does it. So he gives the understanding, before he gives the complete understanding of the vision, he says, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. He said unto me, understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. In other words, it's more important that you get the time frame of the vision before you get the vision. Because if you start on the vision, you're not going to know where to put it in time. So Gabriel starts with Daniel, before you get lost in the vision and what it means, you need to understand something. The vision is for the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in deep sleep with my face to the ground, and he touched me and stood me upright. So you can imagine here, I don't know if you've ever had a vision like this, but if you can imagine, if you will, Daniel has this vision. He sees God's people annihilated, all of this stuff, and he wants to know, he wants to understand it completely, and Gabriel says, this vision is the time of the end. In other words, Daniel, you don't even need to worry about it. I just want you to write it down and get it straight. He comes back to him again and says, he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. He's just doubled down, he's doubled down on what he just said, because Daniel probably didn't get it. I would propose that very few people actually get what he just said because they've been taught something else. But if we follow what Gabriel said, he said the vision of the evenings and mornings is at the time of the end. The evenings and mornings did not start at 457 BC. It didn't. If we go by Yeshua's words that he told Gabriel to help Daniel understand, this vision is for the time of the end. And he seals it up in another explanation in case we don't get it. The vision of the evenings and the mornings which are told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Whenever it says many days, and in the future is added, but many days, what it means is way down in the future. And this goes along, actually, with what Daniel was told in Daniel chapter 12. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Friends, that's where we are, is knowledge is increasing. And running to and fro, the question is, what's running to and fro? Running to and fro is not necessarily running back and forth everywhere, except going to and fro in the Word of God, back and forth in God's Word. And that's where our understanding will increase. And what I try to help people understand, we need to go back to the book. Because if we don't go back to the book and we just say, what I have is good enough, we're not going to see the insights that we're finding when we go back to the book, because the spirit of prophecy is enlightening us, helping us understand these visions in the time of the end. And that's why it's important to go back to the book, critically analyze not only what we believe, but critically analyze possibly what I'm saying or what other people are saying. We need to look again. As in we looked at last week in Revelation chapter 10, it's possible that what we have eaten in the past is not going to cut it, and we need to prophesy again with a fuller or a better understanding of the books of Daniel and Revelation. Father in heaven, we ask that you would continue to lead and guide us. We do not want to be deceived, and therefore we need to know what is truth. We ask that you keep unfolding your word to us and help us to understand that's really where it's at. Be with us now, we pray, as we move forward in your word and your truth and in faith. We pray in Yeshua's name. Amen. Amen.